trouble over land and sea and air. G.I. Joe is there. Can the world oppose the deadliest of foes? Cobra. Joes will risk it all to end the evil call of Cobra. They never give up, they never say die. Walking tall with banners high, they sound the battle cry. G.I. Joe there, G.I. Joe, American hero. G.I. Joe is there, fighting for freedom wherever there's trouble over land and sea and air. G.I. Joe is there.
G.I. Joe is the code name for America's daring, highly trained Special Mission Force. Its purpose, to defend human freedom against Cobra, a ruthless terrorist organization determined to rule the world.
G.I. Joe, G.I. Joe there, G.I. Joe, American hero. G.I. Joe there, fighting for freedom wherever there's trouble over land and sea and air. Retreat! Retreat! G.I. Joe, hero. G.I. Joe is there. G.I. Joe.
Yo, Joe! He'll fight for freedom wherever there's trouble. G.I. Joe is there. G.I. Joe, American hero. G.I. Joe is there. It's G.I. Joe against Cobra and Destro, fighting to save the day. He never gives up. He's always there, fighting for freedom over land and air. G.I. Joe, American hero. G.I. Joe is there.
G.I. Joe is the code name for America's daring, highly trained Special Mission Force. Its purpose, to defend human freedom against Cobra, a ruthless terrorist organization determined to rule the world.
He never gives up. He'll stay till the fight's won. G.I. Joe will dare. G.I. Joe, American hero. G.I. Joe. Wherever there's trouble, G.I. Joe is there. G.I. Joe, G.I. Joe is there. It's G.I. Joe against Cobra, the enemy, fighting to save the day. He never gives up. He's always there, fighting for freedom over land and air. G.I. Joe, G.I. Joe is there.
G.I. Joe is the code name for America's daring, highly trained Special Mission Force. Its purpose, to defend human freedom against Cobra, a ruthless terrorist organization determined to rule the world.
He never gives up. He'll stay till the fight's won. G.I. Joe will dare. G.I. Joe. G.I. Joe. Yo, Joe! Fight for freedom wherever there's trouble. G.I. Joe is there. G.I. G.I. Joe against Cobra, the enemy, fighting to save the day.
America's daring, highly trained Special Mission Force. Its purpose, to defend human freedom against Cobra, a ruthless terrorist organization determined to rule the world.
He never gives up, he'll stay till the fight's won. G.I. Joe there, G.I. Joe, American hero, G.I. Joe.
Yo, Joe!
He'll fight for freedom wherever there's trouble. G.I. Joe is there, G.I. Joe, American hero, G.I. Joe is there. It's G.I. Joe against Cobra, the enemy, fighting to save the day. He never gives up, he's always there, fighting for freedom over land and air. G.I. Joe, American hero, G.I. Joe is there.
G.I. Joe is the code name for America's daring, highly trained Special Mission Force. Its purpose, to defend human freedom against Cobra, a ruthless terrorist organization determined to rule the world.
He never gives up, he'll stay till the fight's won. G.I. Joe will dare, G.I. Joe, G.I. Joe.
The sky comes a fearful cry. Cobra, Cobra, armies of the night, evil taking flight. Cobra, Cobra, nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Panic spreading far and wide. Who can turn the tide?
G.I. Joe, American hero. Yo, G.I. Joe there. G.I. Joe, American hero. G.I. Joe is there, fighting for freedom wherever there's trouble over land and sea and air. G.I. Joe is there. Can the world oppose the deadliest of foes? Cobra, Cobra, Joes will risk it all to end the evil call of Cobra, Cobra. They never give up, they never say die, walking tall with banners high. They sound the battle cry. G.I. Joe, American hero. G.I. Joe there. G.I. Joe, American hero. G.I. Joe is there, fighting for freedom wherever there's trouble over land and sea and air. G.I. Joe is there.
G.I. Joe is the code name for America's daring, highly trained Special Mission Force. Its purpose, to defend human freedom against Cobra, a ruthless terrorist organization determined to rule the world.
G.I. Joe, American hero. G.I. Joe there. G.I. Joe, American hero. G.I. Joe is there, fighting for freedom wherever there's trouble over land and sea and air.
Retreat! Retreat!
G.I. Joe, American hero. G.I. Joe is there. G.I. Joe.
the code name for America's daring, highly trained Special Mission Force. Its purpose, to defend human freedom against Cobra, a ruthless terrorist organization determined to rule the world.
Yo, Joe! We'll fight for freedom wherever there's trouble. G.I. Joe is there. G.I. Joe, American hero. G.I. Joe is there. It's G.I. Joe against Cobra and Destro, fighting to save the day. He never gives up, he's always there, fighting for freedom over land and air. G.I. Joe, American hero. G.I. Joe is there.
G.I. Joe is the code name for America's daring, highly trained Special Mission Force. Its purpose, to defend human freedom against Cobra, a ruthless terrorist organization determined to rule the world.
He never gives up, he'll stay till the fight's won. G.I. Joe will dare. G.I. Joe, American hero. G.I. Joe. Wherever there's trouble, G.I. Joe is there. G.I. Joe, American hero. G.I. Joe is there. It's G.I. Joe against Cobra, the enemy, fighting to save the day. He never gives up, he's always there, fighting for freedom over land and air. G.I. Joe, G.I. Joe is there.
G.I. Joe is the code name for America's daring, highly trained Special Mission Force. Its purpose, to defend human freedom against Cobra, a ruthless terrorist organization determined to rule the world.
He never gives up, he'll stay till the fight's won. G.I. Joe will dare. G.I. Joe, American hero. G.I. Joe. Yo, Joe! Fight for freedom wherever there's trouble. G.I. Joe is there. G.I. Joe, American hero. G.I. Joe is there. It's G.I. Joe against Cobra, the enemy, fighting to save the day. He never gives up, he's always there, fighting for freedom over land and air. G.I. Joe, American hero.
G.I. Joe is the code name for America's daring, highly trained Special Mission Force. Its purpose, to defend human freedom against Cobra, a ruthless terrorist organization determined to rule the world.
He never gives up, he'll stay till the fight's won. G.I. Joe will dare. G.I. Joe, American hero. G.I. Joe. Yo, Joe! He'll fight for freedom wherever there's trouble. G.I. Joe is there. G.I. Joe, American hero. G.I. Joe is there. It's G.I. Joe against Cobra, the enemy, fighting to save the day. He never gives up, he's always there, fighting for freedom over land and air. G.I. Joe, American hero. G.I. Joe is there.
G.I. Joe is the code name for America's daring, highly trained Special Mission Force. Its purpose, to defend human freedom against Cobra, a ruthless terrorist organization determined to rule the world.
He never gives up, he'll stay till the fight's won. G.I. Joe will dare. G.I. Joe, American hero. G.I. Joe.
there's trouble over land and sea and air, G.I. Joe is there. Can the world oppose the deadliest of foes? Cobra. Joes will risk it all to end the evil call of Cobra. They never give up, they never say die. Walking tall with banners high, they sound the battle cry. G.I. Joe there, G.I. Joe, American hero, G.I. Joe is there, fighting for freedom wherever there's trouble over land and sea and air, G.I. Joe is there.
G.I. Joe is the code name for America's daring, highly trained Special Mission Force. Its purpose, to defend human freedom against Cobra, a ruthless terrorist organization determined to rule the world.
G.I. Joe, American hero, G.I. Joe there, G.I. Joe, American hero, G.I. Joe there, fighting for freedom wherever there's trouble over land and sea and air.
Retreat! Retreat!
G.I. Joe, American hero, G.I. Joe is there, G.I. Joe.
They'll fight for freedom wherever there's trouble. G.I. Joe is there. G.I. Joe!
International heroes, G.I. Joe is there.
G.I. Joe against the ruthless enemy, fighting to save the day. They never give up. They're always there, fighting for freedom over land and air. G.I. Joe!
International heroes, G.I. Joe is there.
G.I. Joe is the code name for an international, highly trained Special Mission Force. Its purpose, to defend human freedom against a ruthless terrorist organization determined to rule the world.
They never give up. They'll stay till the fight's won. G.I. Joe will dare. G.I. Joe!
International heroes, G.I. Joe.
Got to get tough, yo, Joe. Got to get tough, yo, Joe. You know you got to stand tall when it comes down to the wire. You got to play rough when you cross that line of fire. You got to have guts to stand for your rights. You got to keep a grip enough to hold on tight. You got to do the fighting with all of your might. You got to keep the target straight ahead in your sights. Got to get tough, yo, Joe. Got to get tough, yo, Joe. G.I. Joe, America's top secret mobile strike force team. Yo, Joe. The mission, to defend freedom. Yo, Joe. The threat, Cobra, an evil organization bent on world conquest. Yo, Joe. The battle cry, yo, Joe. Got to get tough, yo, Joe. Got to get tough, yo, Joe.
Surrounded on all sides, the odds of survival are 1,000,000 to 1.
G.I. Joe Street.
And with the collapse of the former superpower,
Several powerful factions now vie for control.
The threat is real. An evil organization calling itself Scar.
only as Skull. Their goal, nothing short of total world domination, led by this man, known only as Iron Claw.
We will be victorious! Not on my watch!
G.I. Joe Street.
Situation critical.
Roll call!
Ballistic. Harpoon.
Mayday!
Black Dragon.
Sergeant Savage!
Quick Strike. Melvin. Right.
Lieutenant Stone!
The odds are 1,000,000 to 1.
And that's the way we like it!
G.I. Joe Street. name for a highly trained special mission force. Its objective, stop Cobra, stop Cobra. Sigma 6, be a hero. G.I. Joe will turn the tide. Be a hero. Sigma 6 is on your side. Be a hero. Be the best of the best. Whenever there's a mission, G.I. Joe is there. Take command, heavy duty on the scene. Snake guys hand to hand, long range, lean and mean. Scarlet, ready to fight. Turbo red ignite. Wherever Cobra strikes, wherever they attack, G.I. Joe will fight. There's no turning back. Yo, Joe! Be a hero! G.I. Joe will turn the tide! Be a hero! Sigma 6 is on your side! Be a hero! Be the best of the best! Whenever there's a mission, G.I. Joe is there. Sigma 6!
Prep for action.
Communication is reacquired.
All games end today.
Accused of a crime they didn't commit, a ragtag band of fugitives fights a covert battle to clear their names and expose the insidious enemy that is Cobra. Some call them outlaws. Some call them heroes. But these determined men and women think of themselves only as ordinary Joes. And this is their story.
Say the name G.I. Joe to a Gen Xer, and the casual fan will probably yell, "Yo, Joe!" and then rattle off names like Duke, Flint, Lady J, and Shipwreck.
I'd rather save yours.
God, I hate Shipwreck. It makes sense. For most people, G.I. Joe is defined by the Sunbow cartoon. And that's a shame, because contrary to what many know, G.I. Joe didn't start with Duke, or Roadblock, or Destro. G.I. Joe's relaunch as a real American hero started in 1982 with a stellar comic book by Larry Hama that had a completely different continuity from the cartoon and lasted years beyond it. It all started with 13 soldiers whose design evoked the look and feel of the U.S. Army in the 1980s. Dark green, Army uniforms, fairly realistic weapons. It reminds you of films like Red Dawn or First Blood or even Tank. I'm continually surprised that a lot of people and fans of G.I. Joe from my generation have never heard of these characters. So allow me to introduce you to the first 13 members of G.I. Joe. Clayton Abernathy, Denver, Colorado, codename Hawk. West Point graduate, top of his class. The original leader of G.I. Joe wasn't Duke, it was Hawk. Now you might think that you know who Hawk is because you've seen the G.I. Joe movie. That's actually a promoted version of the original Hawk character. That's the general. Hawk in the original 13 was a lower ranking officer, but he was still the head of the original pantheon of G.I. Joes. The cool thing about Hawk was that he didn't come on a card. He came with the mobile missile system, which was this massive ground-to-air strike missile tripod with a fold-out computer. He stood beside it authoritatively and, I guess, dealt out death, or used it to get the other Joes to follow his orders. Alvin Kibbe, Gatlinburg, Tennessee. Codename Breaker. Communications officer and expert in covert electronics. Breaker is an interesting character in the original 13 Joes. You probably saw him all the time on the cartoon, but didn't realize that he was one of the original 13 members of the toy line. Breaker is generally depicted in the cartoon with a gray uniform, and he's always at the communication station with his headset on. But Breaker was cool because, like the rest of the 13 Joes, he had a real function that the military would have in an infantry squad. He was the radio guy. So Breaker is actually a useful addition to G.I. Joe for those realistic missions. Lonzo Wilkinson, Detroit, Michigan. Codename Stalker. Former gang leader, fluent in 5 languages. By today's standards, Stalker would be classified as the token black guy in G.I. Joe. But at the time the original 13 members came out, Stalker had a useful function as the second-in-command to Hawk. Stalker was the point man on their missions, while Hawk stayed back and gave out the orders. Stalker actually served a big role in the original animated miniseries as well, The Mass Device. He was one of the most active members of the group at that point. So Stalker got lucky because he was a strong character in the beginning of G.I. Joe's comic book series, and he was a strong character in the beginning of G.I. Joe's animated series, which was rare. Robert Graves, Columbus, Ohio. Codename Grunt. Straight up soldier, cool under fire. I've known more than a few collectors and G.I. Joe fans who think that Grunt is just a troop builder figure, like a stormtrooper or a Cobra enemy. But in reality, in the comic book, Grunt was a specific character with a real personality. Larry Hama actually wrote into the comic book series later that Grunt was discharged from G.I. Joe honorably and then went off to finish college. He was a fleshed-out, three-dimensional human being, but for most people, Grunt is just a generic army soldier. He's got the M16 and the Musette bag. He looks like a background character in a Vietnam movie. So I guess depending on what your priorities are, you can see Grunt as either a unique individual or you can just see him as background fodder for your toy collection. Ralph Pulaski, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Codename Steeler. Comes from a blue-collar family. Driver of the Mobat. Unlike the Star Wars toy line from Kenner, G.I. Joe actually included pilots and drivers with their vehicles, which was really cool. Steeler is one of the most famous original drivers. If you were lucky enough to get Steeler, then that means you got the Mobat tank with him, and you were one lucky kid. The Mobat's sitting behind me right now, and it's easily the coolest tank Hasbro ever made for G.I. Joe. The thing was motorized, it had rubber treads, it could drive over anything. Books, blankets, your pets. James Barney, Chippewa Falls, Wisconsin. Codename Grand Slam. Sci-fi and comic book junkie. Operator, Jump Jetpack. Grand Slam is an interesting member of the G.I. Joe team because he's one of the only characters that was visibly changed from the 1982 straight-arm versions into the 1983 swivel-arm versions. Originally, Grand Slam had these red protective pads all over his uniform, and he came with a large artillery cannon. But in 1983, they changed it so that he had these silver pads and a visored helmet, and he came with the Jump Jetpack, which is arguably a lot cooler. Mark Brenston, Chicago, Illinois. Codename Short Fuse. Comes from a military family. Certified math genius. I wish I had something cool to say about Short Fuse. He's not a bad character. As a matter of fact, what makes him great is that he fills another traditional role in an infantry squad. He's the mortar and artillery soldier. Again, very realistic roles for these characters up front, not caricatures at all. Short Fuse had a strong role in the beginning of the comic book series, but like so many of the original 13, he was slowly pushed off to the sidelines as Hasbro introduced new figures. Lance Steinberg, Asbury Park, New Jersey. Codename Clutch. Street racer. Greases his hair with motor oil. Chews on the same toothpick for months. Clutch is one of my favorite G.I. Joes because he was my first G.I. Joe figure. And because he was a driver, he came with the Vamp Jeep, which had the big machine gun on the back. Clutch didn't have as prominent a role in the cartoon after it got going. But in the comic book, he was always a strong character and tended to evolve. Larry Hama paid a lot of attention to him. His second incarnation, he became the driver of the Vamp Mark II, which was the desert version of the Jeep, which was really cool because it had doors and a roof, and it had a missile launcher on the back. Rafael Melendez, New York City, New York. Codename Zap. Bazooka Soldier, Demolitions Expert. Zap is the G.I. Joe Bazooka Soldier, not to be confused with Zap Brannigan from Futurama or Zap Rousdower from The Final Sacrifice. Zap is cool because not only did he come with this massive bazooka weapon, Zap is also interesting in hindsight because Zap is Hispanic. And I like the fact that he's not a caricature. Like everybody else in the original 13, he wears the same standard uniform they do, and they're all equal. I think that's really cool. I think it speaks to something that was really progressive that was going on with G.I. Joe at that time that quickly just got dumbed down, and then we ended up with characters that were visibly different from one another racially. And I'm not trying to put political correctness into this video at all. I'm just saying that as far as subtlety and a deft hand for design goes, and Larry Hama's writing, Zap is a much more interesting and enriching character to G.I. Joe than the ones that came after him. Anthony Gambello, Lodi, California. Codename Flash. Electronics expert. Laser rifle operator. Flash is my absolute favorite G.I. Joe of all time. Not just of the original 13 members, but of all the G.I. Joes. He wasn't used very much, which is a shame because he's really cool, but I will say he's in the intro of the original cartoon miniseries of each episode, which I think is awesome. And in the comic book, he was used pretty strongly up front, not as strongly as a lot of the other characters, and then he slowly sort of petered out like the rest of them did. I think the reason I liked Flash so much was not just because he was one of my first G.I. Joes, and I know that has a lot to do with it, but because he just looked so unique. He had the red protective pads like Grand Slam and the visored helmet, but he also had this cool backpack with a laser rifle attached to it via cable. Craig McConnell, Malibu, California. Codename, Rock and Roll. Surfer, weightlifter, guitarist, machine gunner. I remember when I was a little kid and G.I. Joe had first come out that Rock and Roll was one of the most popular action figures for kids to get because he was the machine gunner. He had the 2 bullet bandoliers crosswise over his chest, and he came with a massive bipod machine gun, and he was always seen riding around on the Ram motorcycle. He had the blonde beard, and he was the surfer guy. Rock and Roll was one of the most memorable of the original 13 Joes for kids who remember them on the toy aisles. Shayna O'Hara, Atlanta, Georgia. Codename Scarlet. Martial arts prodigy, earned her first black belt at 15. Scarlet is probably one of those characters you think you know because you've seen the cartoon. She's the redhead with the ponytail and the crossbow. But if you don't know the original 13 Joes and you don't know Larry Hama's comic book, you probably don't know much about Scarlet at all. Now, in the cartoon, Scarlet was depicted as having a relationship with Duke, sort of a sophomoric romance type of relationship. But in the comic book, it was never that way. Scarlet's core relationship was with Snake Eyes, and that was the central dramatic direction of the comic book throughout its whole run. Scarlet always maintained her identity apart from Snake Eyes, despite the fact that she was his girlfriend. Scarlet is a strong, fearless character. She has just immovable conviction, and the courage that she exhibits in the comic book is, to say the least, incredible. A lot of people remember Snake Eyes as having a wolf companion named Timber, but that's not actually Snake Eyes' first incarnation. His first role was as a demolitions and espionage commando. He didn't have a sword, he wasn't a ninja, he did know 12 martial arts, but I think he was a lot cooler because he was more unique. The 1980s was the ninja craze, but Snake Eyes wasn't, by definition, a ninja at that point. He became a rival for Storm Shadow later in the comic book, and in the cartoon, he frankly got shoved off to the side because he didn't speak. In the comic book, on the other hand, because it's a still visual medium, Snake Eyes was perfect, and he quickly rose to the top. They actually devoted an entire issue to him, issue number 21, which is famous because there's no dialogue, and it's one of the best G.I. Joe issues ever written. I liked these guys a lot because they weren't the caricatures that came soon afterward, and they were some of my first Joes. I find these 13 characters to be more interesting than their successors.
It's here, the G.I. Joe collection. Infantry Trooper, codename Grunt. Bazooka Soldier, codename Zap. Motor Soldier, codename Short Fuse. Laser Rifle Trooper, codename Flash. Ranger, codename Stalker. Communications Officer, codename Breaker. Machine Gunner, codename Rock and Roll. Counterintelligence, codename Scarlet. Commando, codename Snake Eyes. Each sold separately. G.I. Joe.
In this episode of Retro Blasting, we're not going to talk about an entire series. We're not going to talk about an entire toy line. I wanted to talk about a specific toy. I wanted to start a sub-series of videos for Retro Blasting called Plastic Fantastic, and this is the first episode. The challenge was, which toy do I choose? And naturally, I hadn't talked about the most important action figure line for boys in the 1980s, which was Hasbro's G.I. Joe. The line started in 1982, and it went all the way through the 90s. But there were so many action figure playsets and vehicles that it'll blow your mind just thinking about it. Which one do you start with? A G.I. Joe collector would tell you that the most impressive toy is the USS Flag, the aircraft carrier. I don't agree. I think the USS Flag is impressive in its size, but not a lot of children had it. With that in mind, I made my selection. And I chose the Killer Whale, better known as the hovercraft. I received the Killer Whale in the Christmas of 1984, and I've had it to this day, not in this condition. It went through some restoration, which I'll get into in a minute. But I think the Killer Whale really epitomizes what the G.I. Joe toy line was all about. Massive vehicles with great details and playability. A bevy of gadgets, and they could hold tons of figures, and they could occupy you for hours. What only adds to its charm is the fact that it was produced in the early years of the G.I. Joe line, before they went to neon colors. As you can see, this hovercraft is still army green, which they quickly got away from in subsequent years as they made the characters more flashy. The Killer Whale really is one of the greatest toys that Hasbro ever produced for the G.I. Joe line. Why don't we go through it together, and you'll see what I mean. The G.I. Joe Killer Whale is one of the most iconic vehicles in Hasbro's line, and I think that's due to a combination of its design and its functionality. Not only is it a great plastic vehicle, but it can also float as a hovercraft in a body of water such as a swimming pool or a creek, which provided hours of fun for us when we were kids. The hovercraft was often featured on the G.I. Joe cartoon and in the comic book. The hovercraft boasts an impressive array of play features, including a spring-loaded recon sled, rotating machine gun turrets, removable maintenance hatches and a recon motorcycle, depth charges, working propellers, and working steering vanes. Like many of the vehicles in the G.I. Joe toy line, the Killer Whale also serves as a transport for many of your figures, so that you can deploy large amounts of ground troops to your next battle. Whether it's a mint-out-of-the-box example or a battle-worn one that you've restored, the Killer Whale always looks good when complete. The hovercraft comes with its pilot, Cutter, who's a great example of an understated design in the early figures from G.I. Joe. Because of the many battles in creek beds that mine encountered throughout childhood, I eventually had to restore mine last year. It took some time, and I had to break it down to all of its major components and then rebuild it from the ground up after a good cleaning. The results really paid off. There was one area, the steering vanes, which are so fragile, the only way I could repair them was through a little bit of Home Depot ingenuity. This repair method might seem unorthodox, but given the premium that you have to pay for real steering vanes that aren't broken on these hovercrafts, it was worth it. So now that we've talked about the fun stuff about the hovercraft, let's talk about the not so fun stuff. You can get these for sale all day on eBay. but they're probably going to have broken parts that need replacement, or they're going to be missing parts entirely. It seems like everything about this vehicle is fragile. I'm going to go front to back with you and show you everything that you need to watch out for. Sled ramp. Hinges on the front, often broken, sometimes one, sometimes both. The sled inside is sometimes missing, or its windshield is missing. Main front ramp. The mounting points for the ramp on the body tub itself are often broken. This one, as you can see, still has a piece of it left. Most of the time, they're just sheared off. The cannon nozzles are often missing. The cannon mounting points, if they are missing and you need a replacement, be careful, because the teeth on them, if they're from a used hovercraft, are often sheared off, in which case they won't latch. They'll just sit there loosely, and when you pull the cannon up, they'll pop out. The hatch itself, the main front hatch, hinges, often stressed and cracked or broken. The windows are easily lost because they pop out. Front machine guns, the hinges on the turrets can break and crack, leading you to have to replace the turrets. Missile launchers, the teeth on the bottom of the missile launcher boxes can break, in which case you won't be able to mount them to the arm. The conning tower glass is often missing. The depth charges are often missing. The recon bike is often missing, or missing a wheel, or both. And then the main culprit, and I'll turn this around so that you can see it again one more time. The steering vanes. Now, as you saw earlier, I was able to restore mine through an unconventional method. But for anyone looking for mint condition steering vanes, you're probably going to have to go mint in the box, because very rarely does one of these show up on eBay with the steering vanes intact and original for a loose example. They're just too fragile. They don't survive. The parts for this hovercraft are out there on eBay, depending on what you need. But you're just going to have to be patient and take your time. Mine was from childhood, and it had its own share of broken pieces and parts that were missing. I spent about 3 months on eBay and grabbed the right auctions and found the parts that I needed. But a hovercraft can be a beautiful addition to your G.I. Joe collection. For me, it's one of my centerpieces next to my Moray and my Sky Striker. It's a matter of how patient you're willing to be, but it's worth it.
G.I. Joe is the code name for America's daring, highly trained Special Mission Force. Its purpose, to defend human freedom against Cobra, a ruthless terrorist organization determined to rule the world.
He never gives up. He'll stay till the next one. G.I. Joe will dare. G.I. Joe. G.I. Joe.
Hey everyone, this is a special video for Retro Blasting. We want to dedicate this to Ryan Cutchins. Ryan was a Retro Blasting fan of ours for a long time, and he was a huge G.I. Joe fan. Ryan, this video is dedicated to your memory. We miss you.
G.I. Joe. G.I. Joe.
The concept of the action figure playset is pretty much dead in toy stores today. In fact, you're lucky if a toy line even comes with a vehicle. I know it's a crotchety thing to say, it was better back in my day. But let's face it, the 1980s had the greatest action figure playsets ever. You had castles, mountains, pits, space stations, aircraft carriers, villages, firehouses, towers, fortresses, halls, hills, dromes, sewers, hives, lairs, caves, more dromes, fright zones, and more castles. One of my favorites that I never had the luxury of owning as a child is the G.I. Joe Headquarters Command Center. A lot of collectors put this lower on their list of favorite G.I. Joe playsets because it doesn't have all the action features of the Terrordrome or the massive scale of the USS Flag aircraft carrier. But it is the first all-plastic centerpiece playset in the G.I. Joe line, made in 1983. It amounts to a series of wall panels and floor platforms that you sort of Jenga together.
Jenga, Jenga. You take a block from the bottom and you put it on top. You take a block from the middle and you put it on top. That's how you build a tower, you just don't stop. You gotta build that tower putting blocks on top. And it teeters and it totters as you build it all up. It weebles and it wobbles, but you don't give up. You take a block from the bottom and you put it on top. You take a block from the middle and you put it on top. Till someone knocks it over and that's when you stop. But you start all over putting blocks on top.
A lot of people complain about this playset's key shortcomings, and I'm not going to deny it. There are more than a few. The propensity of the slot tabs to break off, the jail cell door hinges that snap off due to a weak design, as well as the dinky wall defense accessories with attachment slots that crack off easily. And when compared with the previously mentioned playset's advantages of massive size and wowing action features, the G.I. Joe headquarters seems, at a glance, pretty vanilla. But I think those assumptions are wrong. The headquarters captures that general-purpose military feel of the early Joe toy line. It has a 1980s Army feel, which I really like, and contains everything I would expect a headquarters to have. A communications tactical station with security monitors, a holding cell for captured enemies, an armory, a helipad, a defense station, and even a motor pool. The headquarters' first appearance in the comic book involved the Joes installing a portable defense bunker in the mountains where they were holding the captured Cobra Commander under close guard. It was a brilliant move because writer Larry Hama featured the headquarters almost identically to the look and construction of the toy, giving real context for its function. Sunbow featured the headquarters as a much more massive, fully realized construct in the early seasons of the animated series, which only resembled the playset in its overall shape. Where the headquarters stands out from all other playsets is the clear synergy of its design to the rest of the G.I. Joe toys of the time. The headquarters was engineered to incorporate the vehicles into the function of the playset, a very cool concept in my opinion. There was a place for the Vamp Jeep to pull up as well as a bay for the Mobat tank. In both cases they served as part of the headquarters' defensive capabilities, as the bunker walls had cannon slots for their armaments to poke through and engage Cobra. The headquarters also had a helipad for the newly released Dragonfly helicopter and/or the Skyhawk. I can hear the arguments now. If you're thinking, why design a playset that's dependent on other vehicles in the line to be fully functional, that's stupid. I'd like to remind you that the Terrordrome came with the Firebat, which was the feature every kid wanted, and the USS Flag aircraft carrier didn't come with any vehicles. So it was a ship that was designed to hold jets, and if you didn't have any Sky Striker jets or helicopters, it was just as static as the headquarters, if not more so. Despite the torch I carry for the old headquarters playset, I'm not above admitting it has some weird aspects. Unless it's backed up to a mountain, or you always pretend it has rear walls, Cobra will have an easy time driving around the back with a few tanks and pulverizing the Joes. If the vehicles aren't in their garages and Cobra launches a frontal assault, the headquarters is pretty ill-equipped. A few tiny machine guns and that central cannon are the only things keeping those Hiss tanks at bay. This central cannon's design is the weirdest part of the whole fort. I feel sorry for the Joe that gets assigned to this position during a major attack. How would that conversation go?
Excellent! They haven't spotted us! Cobra! Attack!
Stalker, assign battle stations. Clutch, Stealer, prep the vehicles for counterattack. Yes, sir. Rock and roll, front and center. Yes, sir. Man the main cannon. Aw, man! You got a problem, mister. Can I peel potatoes instead? No, better yet, I'll take latrine duty. You better explain yourself, soldier. Dude, you're asking me to sit on top of a cannon without any cover out in the open during a firefight with tanks and attack fighters. Not even a flimsy hatch to pull down over me? I'm a sitting duck up there. Who designed this? The best military in the world. Easy for you to say lightweight. All you do is take phone calls. Why don't you get up there and show me different? I'm, pretty busy here. Yeah, I'll bet. I got a kid cousin who has a radio-controlled dune buggy, but I work for an elite military force that wants me to manually operate a howitzer while Ma Bell over here has Star Trek-style video communications. You're best qualified to man the cannon, rock and roll. Best qualified? Isn't this guy over here a commando and a ninja? Let him do it. He can probably dodge the bullets, too. He'd love it.
He wouldn't love it.
I didn't hear him say he wouldn't.
Didn't hear him say he would.
What's the difference? He never says anything. Or the massive size of the USS Flag aircraft carrier. Homina, 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 homina. It amounts to essentially a bunch of wall panels and floor because it doesn't have the massive size of the Terrordrome or the sheer scale of the USS aircraft carrier. USS aircraft carrier? And likely that's why many playsets in the G.I. Joe line and other action figure lines were standalone. But I can't remember what I was going to say. So, I mean, this is just sweet. Like, this is just, I don't give a This is awesome. It was the great lament for many childhoods of the 1980s. Not enough enemy troops to combat. For some, it was because their parents wouldn't buy them duplicates of figures you already have. For others, it was a calculated choice based on the knowledge that you only received so many toys every year. So when you got the opportunity, you had to make it count, and you didn't want to get something you already had, even though in the back of your mind, more cannon fodder would really enhance your play scenarios. Toy companies wanted you to build your armies too, but they didn't exactly make that easy for you to accomplish.
An entire legion of my best troops awaits them.
Long before the 20th century, you had the pewter and tin soldiers, miniatures that were collected by the children of rich families. In the 20th century, this would become something middle-class kids could collect, and before long, we had the ubiquitous plastic army men, which actually date all the way back to 1938, but found their stride in the 50s and 60s as solid green soldiers sold in bags and buckets for pennies on the dollar. But as action figures became larger with G.I. Joe and Mego, it became more cost prohibitive to have multiples, let alone enough to have a massive army. But thanks to the oil crisis of the 1970s, toys went small again, and Kenner's Star Wars led the charge. Now that figures were only $2 and only 4 inches tall, with the collect them all marketing taking hold, kids saw the possibilities, even if their parents didn't. Kids saw hundreds of stormtroopers in the Star Wars trilogy, so when, like me, you only had one basic stormtrooper figure, it was frustrating. The lone stormtrooper had to be an army all by himself, so like a Lazarus man, my stormtrooper died thousands of times, only to be instantly resurrected again and again. As I was able to find some of the other Imperials, this became less problematic. But I always had a dream of having a squad of standard stormtroopers to fight the rebels. Kenner's Star Wars was full of Imperial troops you could collect in large numbers to build your army. But again, it was only if you were willing to give up the chance at a new unique figure to deliberately buy the same guy over and over. And that's assuming your parents could afford it. And if they could, would they let you do it at all? Most of the time they just said, no, you already have that one. Sometimes I'd get lucky and get a few randomly from people at birthdays. On my 5th birthday, I was given a few Emperor's Royal Guards from various people, so I ended up with 4 of them. Not exactly stormtroopers, but I wasn't in a position to complain. I also received 5 Darth Vaders, a character I already had. If only they'd been stormtroopers. That was another problem. When a kid had a big birthday party, the parents of the friends you invited over could have saved themselves the trouble of coming up with a gift if they just bought you basic troops. They couldn't have gone wrong. Unless that kid is a whiny moron or a total punk, no child in his right mind in the 1980s would have complained about having another stormtrooper or Cobra soldier. If you were a kid who was pretty spoiled, then I'm sure you were fine in this department and had tons of soldiers. Or if you were a kid who didn't get the larger toys like the vehicles and playsets and only received action figures, then it seems you had a better chance of receiving multiple enemy troops.
You know, when I was a kid, my parents weren't big on vehicles because I think those were a little bit more expensive, and I was a big fan of the figures anyway. The stormtroopers weren't plentiful, but they weren't hard to find, so all the core characters that I wanted were already out of the way, so why not stock up on stormtroopers when you can? And I did, and I think I had about 6, 7 stormtroopers when I was a kid.
The weird thing about this is toy companies advertise the idea of army building constantly in their commercials and their print ads, showing kids playing with multiple generic baddies against the heroes, but they didn't make it simpler to get them. Just imagine if Kenner or Hasbro had sold Stormtroopers and Cobra enemies both as single figures and as 3-packs. Then you could have asked for a 3-pack for a birthday or as a stocking stuffer and had an instant boost to your fascist enemy army. I know hindsight is 20/20, but why they didn't think to do that is staggering. Oh, sure, you had department store special 3-packs for distinct Star Wars figures, and Hasbro said, hey, let's double pack Tomax and Zaymot, or let's sell Sergeant Slaughter's Renegades in a 3-pack. But the figures that really needed en masse purchasing options didn't have them. And it wasn't just Star Wars and G.I. Joe. Most of the toy lines had built-in options for bad guy armies. Buck Rogers had the Draconian Soldier, Crystar had the Magma Men, Chuck Norris had Evil Ninjas, the Ninja Turtles had a Foot Soldier, Voltron had the Doom Scavenger, Superpowers had the Parademon, you had Cylons, Nockmaar Soldiers, Tron Guards, and that Eagle guy from Black Star. Masters of the Universe had Hordak's Horde Trooper, which Mattel said right on the card back was a figure you should buy in large numbers. And Star Wars shamelessly tried to get kids to buy piles of metal micro collection figures as well, with the Build Your Armies promotion in 1982 that sent you 6 micro figures of Rebel and Imperial Hoth troops. The fact that they called this promotion Build Your Armies makes the conspicuous absence of army builder multi-packs for the basic stormtroopers kinda inexcusable. But this wasn't just a bad guy's game. There were a few options for building a good guy army as well. In Star Wars, you had the Rebel Soldier and Rebel Commando, as well as a few pilots that could be duplicated. Of course, in Star Wars, you even had aliens that could be turned into armies, like Jawas, Sand People, and Gamorrean Guards. Crystar had a generic Crystal Warrior. Even He-Man had a good guy army option, thanks to the Man-at-Arms figure being without his mustache, giving that figure the ability to be a standard Eternian Guard that you saw sometimes on the series. G.I. Joe had 2 options for this as well. In the background of the G.I. Joe cartoon, you often saw green army guys in helmets as supporting troops. Well, Grunt could double as that guy if you were so inclined, and if you wanted some variety, you could have even used Zaps alongside Grunts. A Christmas catalog photo from the 80s showing the USS Flag aircraft carrier made Shipwreck a generic figure as well, with 20-some-odd shipwrecks as the Navy crew of the Flag. And some specific bad guys were depicted as cannon fodder on occasion. Take the Mutants and Thundercats. Early on, you see multiple Slythes, Monkeans, and Jackalmen. And there was that one time on G.I. Joe that Lady J fought an army of Storm Shadows?
Dispose of them! They are not worthy of my efforts!
Girls experienced army building problems in their toy lines too. When you have 20 Barbies and only one Ken, the imaginary dramas that can unfold are somewhat limited. Although admittedly, a multi-pack of Ken dolls to testosterone boost your Barbie collection is an unsettling idea.
But the 1980s are over, and most of us don't even have our toys anymore. However, whether you have your toys or not, most of us share the same experience. And that's not just an assumption on my part. I asked Retroblasting's 8,000 Facebook followers about their experience with action figure troops and duplicates, and the vast majority who responded never had duplicates of any of them. This comment right here says it all. We always had a saying, you knew the rich kids from the poor kids by counting their stormtroopers. And that shared generational experience is what has brought us to the reality that most toy collectors face today. So many of us dreamed of having armies of bad guys that we can't own just one stormtrooper or Cobra enemy as an adult. We have to own multiples. And some of us have taken it a step further still, and these people are known as army builders. They're not content with a modest handful that might have been possible when we were kids. They want literal armies of action figures. I've even encountered vintage toy dealers that won't sell stormtroopers or Cobra enemies because they're obsessed with building massive armies of bad guys. The result is that some of the most common figures in these toy lines command some of the highest prices. For example, the common stormtrooper was sold continuously from 1978 to 1985, but despite being one of the most numerous figures in existence, he's a premium figure on the secondhand market because of army builders gobbling them up. Same goes for the Cobra enemy, the only G.I. Joe figure sold 4 years in a row from 1982 to 1985, but he demands high prices because collectors want 400 of them for display. At least he doesn't carry the added premium of being made from white plastic like the Stormtrooper. Since most white plastic toys run the risk of yellowing over time, there's an extra cost to pay for a minty white trooper, making the Stormtrooper brutal on your wallet. I won't lie and say the idea of army building isn't tempting, but I avoid the bug by limiting myself to between 6 and 8 of the basic troops, and 3 to 4 of the specialty troops like AT-AT drivers or Cobra eels. This also helps me achieve a more varied display. Plus, all it would take is a few army builders' homes going up in flames, and an inordinate number of these figures would be lost in a single go. But I do understand what drives this hobby. It's those memories we can't shake. For me, it was losing Star Wars weapons, so I've obsessively hunted them down again for my action figures. For army builders, it was that inability to conduct massive scale battles that drives them, or an innate love of fascist uniformity. And let's be clear, army building is the collection of mass numbers of generic troops, not to be confused with another collecting phenomenon known as focusing, in which you collect mass numbers of a unique character figure. The act of focusing is better known by another name: hoarding. In recent years, Hasbro has finally figured out the need for troop builder packs. In 2004, they did a big pack of Cobra troops for their G.I. Joe Valor vs. Venom line. In 2008, they sold multi-packs of German soldiers and Cairo assassins for their Indiana Jones figure set. And they have had a few attempts at Star Wars troop builder sets, though the clones were just in-scale posed miniatures. The Evolution set was 3 troops from totally different eras, and the recent Stormtrooper multi-pack was an Amazon exclusive. So here's to army building, a dream we all shared that some of us have actually achieved with staggering success. And just remember, if an army builder's toy collection attacks your toy collection, at best it will be Dunkirk. And at worst, it'll be Return of the King, where their toy collection is the Army of the Dead, and your toys are the orcs.
Hey, we could build an army of cats.
No.
So, are we doing this?
You mean the back and forth that ends with a snarky comment?
Yes.
I honestly don't feel like it today.
Good. Me neither.
We gotta get back to the past, to the 20th century. Digging through the bubble wrap into your memories. Back was the collector, he's protecting what we find. The labels having metal guns keep us safe through time. Retro blasting.
This is not a toy.
Just the corners of your mind. Retro blasting. The stuff you love since you were 9. Blasting into the past. See what brings still last. Retro blasting.
Kenner Star Wars is, for many, the patient zero of great toys. The line is so legendary that many of the designs and quirks of the toys are just taken for granted. One of these eccentricities plagues pretty much the entire run and makes no sense at all. I've often heard the criticism that the lack of posability in Star Wars figures was a common gripe during playtime. Certainly, G.I. Joes were more versatile in this respect, but it never bothered me that much. What did irk me was Kenner's devotion to rendering one hand of many of their figures completely useless.
I would assume that it was because of the type of machining that it takes to actually make a hand that's usable, because obviously it would probably include more plastic to make a cupped hand than an open hand, okay? Because you need to lengthen the length around the weapon. So I assume it's a tooling decision to save a penny.
All I can say is I think that Kenner was going for a playable action figure with a lot of playability, yes. But I think Kenner was going for a posable action figure as well. I think what they were going for is they were going for more of a specific pose on a lot of these figures.
Whether it was a style choice or a cost-cutting measure, Kenner rendered the left hands of their figures unable to hold accessories. Given that most characters only came with a single accessory anyway, it might not seem like a big deal, but it would have been cool to have figures dual-wield blasters once in a while. And some of the key characters were left crippled by the design. Most notably, the main hero.
Luke, Farm Boy, is completely useless. I mean, he doesn't really have much of anything, considering the fact that he's kind of, already holding the hilt of a white, nondescript lightsaber.
Luke Skywalker was given a permanent lightsaber up one of his arms for the saber activation gimmick, but his left hand wasn't designed to compensate and couldn't hold anything, which is frustrating given that Luke never uses a lightsaber in combat in Star Wars, and is best remembered firing that Stormtrooper blaster on the Death Star.
Luke does have a hand that is semi-usable, the one not holding the lightsaber, of course, because he could probably use a Princess Leia blaster, or further on down the line, he could probably hold a lightsaber, the second versions that they created, but that would seem pretty weird, him having a lightsaber in both hands. This isn't Attack of the Clones.
What? Darth Vader and Old Ben have the same lightsaber setup, but oddly, Kenobi's left hand is almost usable, even though unlike Luke, he only uses his lightsaber in the film, while Darth Vader is given a flat, open-palmed lefty. This type of hand was good for some things that were very much outside Vader's character, such as waving goodbye, and a reassuring pat on the shoulder. I guess a choking hand was out of the question. Many of the figures were given this open-palmed hand. So many, in fact, that Kenner Star Wars figures are second to none at setting up for drill team practice and throwing up the Nazi salute en masse. The people love you, mein Führer. Ja, wunderbar.
As you can see, Vader's kind of, doing the Heil Hitler thing there.
Both the original and Hoth Han Solo had these hands.
I'm going to go on a limb here. Maybe the reason for his useless hand is the fact that he does have an extra bend in his arm on both figures, and this one even has the workable holster. So there is a possibility that the extra sculpting or tooling it took to bend his arm took away from the fact of making him actually have a usable left hand.
The original Han had one arm tucked for hip shooting, but his straight arm was lame. Hoth Han was similar. In both cases, the most justifiable uses for these hands were working the controls of the Falcon and petting Chewbacca. The poor Tusken Raider was given 2 open palms and stuck in that one pose.
Tusken Raider, he's got the gaffy stick, and he's supposed to be holding it up above his head or kind of here.
The fact that he not only has 2 essentially open hands, but they're turned inside, so making him only able to carry a gaffy stick, which even that's unsuccessful sometimes. He virtually has 2 useless hands.
In rare instances, likely by sheer chance, the useless hand wasn't so useless. Yoda's right hand is in a force pose, so he can lift Luke's X-Wing out of the bog. Boba Fett's passed as his Superman flight hand. Hammerhead's harken back to his days as a cantina DJ. At least the open palm allowed for some interpretation. It was the figures with their hands at their sides with only a slightly parted thumb that were the worst. The number one victim of this design was, once again, Luke Skywalker.
Luke X-Wing, he's got another lobster claw.
Bespin Luke Skywalker was one of the few Star Wars figures to come with two weapons, his blaster and his lightsaber. But Kenner didn't design his hand so he could hold both securely. The blaster can only go in the right hand. You can precariously position the lightsaber in the left hand, but it didn't stay there for play purposes.
That's about the limit of weapons he can actually use. So it doesn't look like it was a very practical design.
And if you leave the blaster in the right hand too long, it stretches the fingers to the point that the lightsaber won't stay in there at all. Kenner corrected the left hand with Jedi Luke Skywalker and carried it over to Endor Luke Skywalker, as both were given two functional hands. Biker Scout also had two working hands, so he could operate the speeder bike. Then you had characters where both hands were so badly designed it didn't even matter. Take 9 Numb and TIE Fighter Pilot. The right hand is barely more usable than the left. There was one figure in the Kenner line that had two beefy, usable hands, and that was the Rebel Commando. Unfortunately, they decided to give him a gun he couldn't hold because the handle was too big. The worst hands in the line were on the droids, and no, I don't mean droids like 8D8 and 21B, where the hands were accurate to the film robots. No, I'm talking about C-3PO and Death Star droid, where the hands are supposed to be human-like, but are frozen together in this underhanded position that's only useful at cupping Weequay's.
Remco in 79 produced a Monsters line who did not have any articulation or ability to hold something. Care Bears in 83 had only one usable hand. And yes, 84 produces Masters of the Universe, and they too only have one usable hands. This was something that clearly was a design choice that was shared by Mattel, Remco, and other companies of the time of the early 80s.
I mean, out of the 21 that we've got here, Hammerhead has a useless hand, Greedo has a useless hand, C-3PO, Chewbacca, Princess Leia. Most of them have useless hands, so I guess that's just the way it is. And, you know, to be honest with you, when I was a kid, I didn't really consider it, and it was something I just played with, because as long as they've got a weapon in one hand, either left or right, it didn't make any difference to me.
I think the true game changer came with the emergence of G.I. Joe, who constantly produced figures that can use both hands, and of course Transformers also did the same on most of their line.
When you have two hands that are the exact same thing or the exact same way, I just don't think that it makes it interesting. I think if you've got one hand that's holding a blaster and another hand that is not able to hold a blaster but is still interesting enough to strike an interesting pose and make the figure look interesting, I don't think that it's a problem.
When you consider that other lines like G.I. Joe, Buck Rogers, and even Kenner's own Indiana Jones generally had action figures with two usable hands, it's strange to see how Kenner tied one hand behind the back of 95% of its Star Wars lineup.
At least there was some kind of functionality to them. You know, well, maybe not a whole lot of functionality.
DV! Get out of my way.
But DV!
You may dispense with the pleasantries. Let's get to it. You left me behind. I'm shocked.
DV, I never said I'm moving giving you up.
Do you know how far I've had to travel?
12 parsecs?
Light years. All because one morning you've up and gone into the blue.
What do I have to do to get the message through? It was an accident. I can't step back in time and change what happened.
Put yourself in my place. Just for once, come into my world.
Okay, fine. Confide in me. If you hate me so much, why bother coming back?
Better the devil you know.
I'm genuinely sorry you were left behind. It won't happen again.
Put your hand on your heart and tell me it's all over. I won't believe it till you do.
Isn't my word good enough?
I am altering the deal. Do you refuse?
Yes, you're being ridiculous. I wouldn't change a thing.
Do you dare? It's never too late to change your mind.
He'll shut up soon. Won't be long now. Breathe.
You're messing with a time bomb, and I might explode.
I should be so lucky.
Sensitized by every word that you say.
You gonna keep spinning around with this song and dance for a little while longer?
What do you mean?
Because I just got a call. Your disco needs you.
We gotta get back to the past, to the 20th century. Digging through the bubble wrap into your memories. Like was the collector, he's protecting what we find. Relentless heavy rhythms keep us safe through time. Retro blasting.
This is not a toy.
Just the corners of your mind. Retro blasting. The stuff you love since you were 9. We're blasting into the past. See what thrill still lasts. Retro blasting.
When Kenner received the Star Wars license in 1977, they weren't in the action figure business as we know it today. Much like Hasbro had done with their original G.I. Joe, Kenner was making toys at a larger scale, most notably the $6 million Man and Bionic Woman, done in the 12-inch doll size. The designers at Kenner made the figures 3 3/4 inches tall, because they realized that Star Wars was a toy line based just as much on vehicles as it was on characters, and so they had to be smaller. But Kenner didn't stray completely from its success with Lee Majors. A line of 12-inch Star Wars dolls were made as well, but by 1980 it was clear the action figures were the best investment, and so the larger size figures were canceled just as The Empire Strikes Back landed in theaters.
I can't believe you're making me do this.
But the pendulum of scale wasn't done swinging at Kenner's offices. In 1982, they decided to launch another line of toys, one that was even smaller than their insanely successful action figures, the Micro Collection. Whether this was because of the massive Battle of Hoth in The Empire Strikes Back, or a desire to sell more complex playsets and appeal to a different kind of toy collector, Kenner went die-cast, and the result was both amazing and totally frustrating. The idea behind the line seems to have been greater scale possibilities for the settings, so the figures themselves were barely an inch tall in most cases, made of solid die-cast metal and painted. On a scale of 1 to 10, this puts the novelty of the Micro Collection at 50, but the limitations of the medium are obvious and immediate. The figures don't move. The poses they have are the poses you get. Some of them work pretty well, pointing their blasters or attacking with lightsabers. A lot of them, though, don't have action-oriented poses at all. Han Solo seems to be taking a crap while wagging his blaster like he's swing dancing. Luke's blaster is pointed slightly too high. Lando's blaster is hanging limply downward. Boba Fett is at parade rest. Lobot is flamboyantly pointing, and it's so ridiculous, I'm certain the Micro Collection inspired the famous Robot Chicken sketch. Some of the characters were supposed to be posed as if they were wounded, but it didn't always track. This stormtrooper, for example, is supposed to be getting hit, but it looks like he's breaking up an argument.
Those were the droids we were looking for, Dave. Whoa, guys, calm down.
Or this snowtrooper that is supposed to be taking a blast to the chest. However, at a glance...
Hey, Larry, I heard a good one. Yeah? What do you call a snow trooper's girlfriend? I don't know. A skirt chaser.
The paint on the figurines chips easily. If you played with them with any regularity, they probably ended up pretty battered. There was no avoiding it. Because they were so small, they were grouped with vehicles in playsets much like Lego minifigures. If you wanted certain characters, you had to find specific playsets. The majority of the micro collection focuses on The Empire Strikes Back, and with good reason. The scale of the Hoth battle really warrants a bigger scope. The Hoth World playsets from the micro collection give us the edifice of Echo Base with the ion cannon, and a series of great mechanical gimmicks like the shield doors of the base that can open and close with the raising of a guard turret. The playsets connected together, which added to their appeal. For example, your Wampa Cave wouldn't always be standalone if you had the ion cannon to attach it to, or the generator attack playset, or the turret defense playset. And as I said, which ones you had determined which characters you received. If you wanted Luke on a Tauntaun, you needed turret defense. If you wanted Han Solo on a Tauntaun, you had to get the ion cannon set. If you wanted Han pointing his blaster, you had the option of turret defense, or if you wanted him in ultra crouch, Wampa Cave. The way Kenner told them apart was through little descriptions that were usually pretty on point, like Luke in Stormtrooper disguise. But if the figures were really similar, like variations of the same character, it could get a little confusing. The Han with Wampa Cave is called Han Solo Firing, while the Han Solo with Turret Defense is called Han Solo Stalking. Stalking what? The only thing he ever stalked in the film was the probe droid. Seems like Stalker Han should have been with the Wampa Cave and Shooting Han put with Turret Defense. Kenner also loved Darth Vader pointing for some reason, and did a lot of variations on this pose. Vader pointing, Vader beckoning, Vader using the Force. When Vader puts his hands on his hips, he's Vader in command. And Vader doesn't walk. Apparently, he struts. Yes, Kenner gave us Vader strutting.
I'm gonna get the sucker, dirty mother. Don't you say that.
The playsets each had special gimmicks to up the ante. The shield generator exploded, or if the rebels successfully defended themselves, the ATST included with the set could be toppled and destroyed. The turrets blew up. Wanton destruction was a big theme of the micro collection. It's like the designers at Kenner weren't content with just the battle damage stickers, they wanted to wreck some stuff, and the micro collection was their outlet. The vehicles were the best example of this. The X-Wing and TIE Fighter each had push-button simulated damage controls. The best part for me as a kid was the pieces didn't separate from the toy, so you didn't lose anything, and as soon as you let go of the button, the vehicle repairs itself. For the most part. The micro collection was also your only option for a major location in Star Wars. Bespin. Unlike Kenner's sole flimsy playset for the basic figures, the micro collection went all in on Cloud City with 3 interlocking playsets: the freeze chamber, the control room, and the gantry. These Bespin playsets really show off the strong points of the micro collection, where most of the basic figure playsets might have had 1 or 2 mechanisms, like a door or an elevator. The micro collection was filled to the brim with gizmos. The freeze chamber, which was the core of the Bespin World sets, had sliding doors, adjustable ramps, an elevator, and the piece de resistance, the freeze chamber trick. The mechanism was essentially a plastic propeller hidden under the main floor. On one prop of the propeller was a tab for Han Solo. On the other prop was a slot for the Carbonite figure. The handle rod was hidden amongst the various greeblies atop the playset. You'd lower the handle, which lowered the figures. Then you'd turn the handle 180 degrees and pull the assembly back up. Han Solo would disappear and the Carbonite would replace him. It was a really cool trick, but it totally sucked that the only figurine of Boba Fett in the entire micro collection just stood there cradling his rifle. The fun didn't stop there. The additional sets, the control room and the gantry, were also based on locations from the final duel in The Empire Strikes Back. The control room had the ability to throw Luke through the big window, and the gantry was the bridge out to the wind vane where Luke loses his hand. It even came with a little handless Luke figure. But what made the sets all the more interesting was Kenner gave them the ability to fit together in multiple ways. You could reconfigure the sets and put them together in a linear fashion or a random fashion. You could even make a staircase to nowhere if you wanted to. I loved these sets because of my fascination with Bespin, even if the fighting Luke and Vader were in fencing poses with the lightsabers.
You're using Bonetti's defense against me, huh?
The sets were so cool, it led to a lot of frustration that they weren't scaled to the standard figures, because that's what I really wanted, and that was a major letdown. I had the standard X-Wing, but I had the Micro TIE Fighter. I could dogfight with them, but it wasn't terribly authentic. I only ended up with the TIE Fighter, the freeze chamber, and the control room. I had fun with them, but I always wished they'd been bigger. Kenner offered the Bespin sets individually and as a massive Bespin World set. They did this with their Hoth sets too, as well as another world that was a surprising revisit, Death Star World. Sold together or separately as the Compactor and the Escape playsets, the Death Star playsets were, like Bespin, an intricate, amazing recreation of the Death Star from the original film, and the end result really puts the bigger Kenner playset to shame. The big blast door that Vader and Kenobi fought in front of was spring-loaded, and it closed with a bang. You had 3 levels of play that included the turbo laser, which exploded, the extending bridge with swing rope, the detention block hallway with a hatch into the compactor, and yes, the compactor had foam debris, a moving wall, and an escape door. There were 2 working elevators, and a rather flimsy tractor beam control extension that clipped to the playset. Like Bespin, the 2 playsets were modular and could be reconfigured multiple ways. 2 of the coolest items in the Micro Collection were department store exclusives, which meant most of us never knew they existed. One was the Snowspeeder. Like the X-Wing, the Snowspeeder had a battle damage feature, and it showed the limitations of the metal figurines that were only partly successful at being both freestanding characters as well as convincing pilots. Dak is fully kneeling in the back seat of that Snowspeeder. It's weird. The cockpit has to be so big, it's more like a greenhouse. Where this limitation is the worst just happens to be the best toy in the Micro line, and arguably one of the best toys in the entire Kenner Star Wars series, the Micro Millennium Falcon. Unlike the bigger Falcon, which was based off the original film, this Falcon was inspired by The Empire Strikes Back. It came with the only micro figurines depicting R2, 3PO, and Han in his blue jacket. It also came with Chewbacca, Lando, and Luke. This Falcon had direct access to the cockpit from the back, but only Han in that weird crouch could fit in there. This Falcon had the entry ramp and the gunner chair, the latter of which was a little bird cage rather than an actual seat. How else would a figurine fit into it? The Micro Falcon is also the only vintage Falcon to actually have both the upper and lower cannons. The standard Falcon and the die-cast Falcon only have the upper cannon. But what I think makes the Micro Falcon so unequivocally cool is the inclusion of the rescue hatch used by Lando at the climax of The Empire Strikes Back. It pops up and the Lando figurine is ready and designed to support the Luke Skywalker figure and bring him back down into the ship. Just take note that the lower push panel for the rescue hatch is often missing on loose examples. And true to Kenner form, the Micro Collection also had a mail-away offer, in which you'd use those precious proofs of purchase. Called Build Your Armies, it was an offer to get 6 Hoth troopers, 3 rebels, and 3 stormtroopers. Kenner had plans to expand the Micro Collection even more into 1983 with the release of Return of the Jedi. They had plans for a Bacta tank playset for the Hoth world, an entire Dagobah world with the swamp and Yoda's house, as well as Jabba's palace and playsets for the second Death Star. But it wasn't to be. If you were like me, you probably got most of your Micro Collection on clearance. As with the 12-inch dolls from a few years before, the Micro idea just didn't catch on. The die had been cast, and die-cast lost.
Are you preparing a video?
Yep.
Excellent. My arms will be fixed soon.
No, that's going to be a restoration. This is going to be a feature project.
No, I am your project. project.
Not today.
But you said
later.
I'm not pointing fingers. I just
Yeah, I can see that.
We gotta get back to the past, to the 20th century. Digging through the bubble wrap into your memories. Back was the collector, he's protecting what we find. The latest heavy metal guns will keep us safe through time. Retro blasting.
This is not a toy.
Just the corners of your mind. Retro blasting. The stuff you love since you were 9. We're blasting into the past to see what brings still lies. Retro blasting.
There are a lot of things in our lives that we want, and at the same time don't want. And both cases usually have lots of reasons. In the past few years, Star Wars collectors have increasingly clamored for a group of action figures, now famously named The Last 17. They were the last hurrah of Kenner Star Wars in 1985, and the prices continue to rise. To hear most collectors tell the tale, The Last 17 are the pinnacle of Kenner Star Wars, far superior to the more prolific toys and characters in the line that we spend our days playing with in the backyard. But are those last 17 really stratospherically greater than the 79 figures that came before them? Star Wars collectors on various forums told me that if Retroblasting ever does a video that even remotely criticizes the last 17, they'll get angry. It's a rare courtesy to be told ahead of time that an angry mob will come after you should you embark on a specific task. Knowing that, I knew I couldn't safely assume anyone shares my observations about the last 17. So on this journey, I've decided to enlist 2 Kenner Star Wars experts and get their opinions as well on these allegedly magnificent 17. Tom Burgess, the founder of IGrewUpStarWars.com, and Jake Stevens, founder of FromForlomToZuckus.com, sat down with Retroblasting for an interview about the last 17. I didn't share my own thoughts with them ahead of the interview, and I had no idea what their takes were either. All of us, while different ages in 1985, were pretty much in the same mental place. Star Wars was long over, and by the time